Okay, so this is about talking about the, climbing the Great Wall, very appropriate, and I think it's a very difficult task, and as we've found out 2 speakers ago, that this cross-cultural challenge is really immense, and the people in industry, they're very used to that sort of challenge, so we need to take note of that. But we need to appreciate the value of those people that did the interpreting, because they know a lot more than we do in terms of our ability to interpret, etc. We did some work for Tourism Australia, but we've done quite a bit of other work, and it's really about understanding. I think Wolfgang made the comment, it's time now to drill down, it's time now to go deeper. It's not just about looking at China as a holistic explanation. We've done that. I was in the Queensland government 20 years ago, and Loftus Harris and people like that, we were looking at these markets. It's now time to dig deeper and go more narrower and find the segments and drill into those segments and get a better result. And I think Richard Beer and I have had some discussions, even the last couple of days, about why are we trying to cover all of China? Why don't we go down to specifics? And fortunately, last year I spent a bit of time in Zhejiang, and as soon as I mention that, people in the room from China actually nod. If I say Zhejiang University, they nod even harder, because they realise that's a really top area to look at China. And there's many of those type of areas, and we need to get better understanding of that. A guy called Douglas North talks about, in institutional economics, he talks about the rules of the game. The rules of the game in China change constantly, and unless we are on top of that, we'll miss the boat. And I think that was coming out this morning.
One of the things we try to do as academics is we try to respond to the complexity of these sorts of challenges by coming up with models and frameworks. What you see up on the screen is just I guess it's an interpretive framework. It's a way that we can present information to you about some of the various challenges associated with improving destination choice, which is one of the objectives of tourism enterprises, like the 4 presented here, as well as the broader tourism sector. So when we start to think about destination choice, we see destination choice as being, I guess, the ultimate goal. That's when an individual tourist, for instance, so when we makes a decision to travel to a place like Australia, or more importantly, makes decisions about the various tourism products they want to consume when they're in a place like Australia. When we start to think about destination choice, it becomes very clear very quickly that we need to understand the market more than we do at the moment. We need to actually understand the challenges associated with engaging with and presenting products to the Chinese market. Now, unfortunately, because of time, we can't go into the sort of detail we'd have liked to have gone into today. But what we can do is we can provide a bit of an overview of some of the factors that influence the choice that is made at the moment by Chinese tourists deciding whether they visit a destination like Australia or they choose some other competing product. So this model that we've presented has been informed by a fairly comprehensive literature review. The articles you see up there may give you the impression there's been quite a bit of research in this space. As you drill down a little bit further, you realise quite quickly that there are really some serious gaps in our knowledge about how decisions are made with regard to a destination and the choice associated. So, for example, a lot of the research that's been done has really looked at Chinese outbound tourism to short-haul markets, the Asian markets and destinations around China. There's a serious gap in terms of our understanding of how differences between the short and long-haul markets and whether or not the frameworks and the models that we've actually developed as academics in a Western society, a Western culture, apply to rapidly emerging markets like China. So when we look at pull, obviously that's really about the things that I want as a consumer, as a travel consumer. And when we actually look at the model, we see that there's really some gaps in the literature that we need to address as academics. And we're putting these up today because hopefully through the latter part of today, the final session, we'll have an opportunity to identify additional knowledge gaps that are aligned to the themes that Neil presented earlier, and consequently to the issues that are associated with those themes. So there's an issue associated with whether or not we actually filter what we understand about China through a Western filter. And I think most people who have had some experience in China know that to be the case, that we try to impose a Western view on the Chinese world. And we need to understand that better, and the best way to do that is to draw closer to our partners in China in the market and to draw alongside people who actually have that understanding.
I think in that context, there's been some work done by Geert Hofstede, and some people in the room will know that material, but he talks about a collectivist culture versus an individualistic culture, and he'll talk about China as a collectivist culture. The more you drill down into some of these factors, you start realising there's areas where they're actually quite individualistic in the way that they approach things. And you get down to southern China, and the approach is quite different in terms of the way consumers perceive things as well. So it is very important when you start looking at these different variables that you start to realise that we're mapping variables for China. We're not just mapping variables for Australia and Western economies.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And as we move down a little bit further, we start talking about pull factors. I mentioned before pull, I actually meant push. When we start talking about pull factors, we're actually really starting to talk about the destination attributes, those things that actually attract visitors from places like China to Australia. And if I can get Anton just to pop up the next slide, the slide above. Okay, we won't bother about it. But one of the things that we've actually found over time is that obviously there's an attraction for different attributes of the Australian product. For example, the nature-based tourism product has a very strong appeal within China. But we also identify, obviously from the research we've done previously, there are other aspects of the tourism product in Australia that are underdeveloped. I think a very good example would be the Indigenous product. And in particular, our ability to be able to capitalise that and deliver a quality, consistent tourism experience. So when we start to think about the things about the Australian experience that actually resonate with our visitors from China, we realise that we have a lot. We have quite a bit of diversity in Australia, which is not cutting through the clutter at the moment. And we need to understand a little bit more about how to do that more effectively. And then when we do get into moderators, so really what we're talking about moderators are those things outside of the individual, the product, that actually influence whether or not they choose Australia as a destination. So internal moderators are really about I guess the way that individuals process information. It might be to do with demographic information. I mean, some of the information we've heard previously today would allude to the fact that there are certain demographics that represent a good market opportunity for Australia. We also know that there's quite a bit of diversity, so we call that heterogeneity within academia. So there's a lot of difference across the broader China market. And what we need to actually do is we need to develop a richer understanding as we drill deeper. And a lot of the work we've done in recent times has really focused on regional differences and understanding of structural factors that influence travel decisions, as well as the travel planning decisions related to the type of media they engage with and the information sources that they actually use. So all of this is available, obviously, to influence the consumer, but as people within the Australian tourism sector trying to appeal to Chinese travellers, we need to actually have a richer and a deeper understanding of how those various factors combine to influence the image of Australia as a destination and consequently the decision to travel here.
I think in that context, we've already heard this morning about shifting trends and etc. We know that in Shanghai there's a generation, I think our speaker two stages back made clear that he brought his parents to a certain Xiaomen. And there's a segment in Shanghai bringing their older generation, now the younger generation, paying for their parents to go to different destinations. So we've got movements there. We've also got things that are quite bizarre for a Westerner in terms of, I know of stories, and some of the people in the room will know of stories of luxury cars not having tinted windows for a very good reason, because conspicuous consumption is very important to the Chinese. To actually be seen to be consuming is actually a very important element, whereas we've seen a shift in our culture in Australia in the last couple of years where we're actually hesitant to do that.
Let's go down 2 slides. So I guess one of the things that we would suggest, and I guess a research opportunity or an agenda item for discussion later when we do our round tables, is that does our understanding of tourism or travel markets apply? And I know that we look at the China market, and there's been quite a bit of talk over the last week or so, specifically about the movement towards assisted FIT and FIT. So they're independent travellers who have the means and the resources to travel independently. They also have they're much more mature in terms of the travel continuum. So they've had some experience and they're looking to Australia to visit Australia either again, or they've got quite a bit of experience in other markets of a comparative nature. When we start to move into that space, obviously the models and our understanding, our theory that we've developed in the past has more application. So it's more relevant. But in the absence of that sort of experience, then there's a real question as to whether or not the markets, the models that we're actually using are actually applicable in rapidly emerging markets like China and other markets.
Yeah, we've been doing some research. For example, I've got a DBA student doing some research on Guangxi in different regions in China. And Chongqing's one of those regions, and we had a discussion in Cairns about food and the importance of food. And Chongqing, people in the room will know, they like hot food. And there are a couple of other stories there, but we'll keep them to a minimum. But there's hot food, and they're hot-tempered, and they're loud. So if you don't know that, you don't appreciate the people. But the people in Chongqing are lovely, and they're great people to have a discussion with and have a dinner with. But that's a different taste. There's different aspects. So, one thing that we don't realise, we talked about food the other day and the importance, but, when it comes to food, we need to understand more of what the rationale behind food was, and they were discussing that in the panels. It is about relationships. That's where relationships are built, when food's on the table. But that goes back historically also to the fact of survival. Food was survival. So that's an appreciation that we don't have, that we have to actually grow that appreciation. If we want to target these markets more specifically and right down to that deeper level, we have to understand that.
Okay, so these sorts of differences influence the types of processes people go through when deciding to travel to a place like Australia, the different travel episodes, if you like. So sometimes it's influenced by perceptions they have of the destination that have been developed over time through media, and sometimes it's a consequence of close filial relationships and the emphasis and importance of spending quality time with individuals that you care and desire to spend time with. Sometimes it's around issues associated with structural factors and whether or not they can actually travel to a destination in the time frame that's available to them, given the labour market conditions in China. So I guess what we would advocate is that the traditional linear model where you desire something, you actually do some research, information search, and actually refine your options. You then choose from within an evoke set, a smaller set, a consideration set, and then consequently decide and make the planning decisions associated with going there. May not necessarily apply, particularly when we actually move to the least developed parts of China.
I think in the context of that, a lot of people have talked about China as a black box or a paradox. I think it's important that we do understand that. There are many philosophical underpinnings to why it's a paradox. What our challenge is as academics is to unravel the paradox. And it can be broken down. Good operators like David James we've heard today, he's broken the paradox. He knows how to get into China. He knows what to do. There's a number of other Australian business people who are doing the same thing. So as long as we understand what the parameters are and we start to drill in on some of these aspects and actually get better knowledge about it, we can actually do better. So there is hope. It's not just a black box.
So, and then traditional understanding about push and pull factors and internal and external moderators will actually influence those sorts of pathways or episodes of travel. But there's another theoretical question here, isn't there? So I've made I guess a bit of an issue of whether our theoretical frameworks or models are applicable. There's even a question about whether or not the theoretical approach, so our conceptual frameworks are applicable. So if we talk about tourism as a marketing product, it's very much rooted or grounded within goods dominant logic. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about transactions. So we understand the market, we develop a product, we bring the two together and we do business as a transaction. China is a very much a relationship culture. Sometimes it's actually not about the transaction at all, or if it is about the transaction, it's certainly not about the transaction today. That transaction will come in time. And it's very much about a service-oriented culture, and it's about co-creation of value. It's about understanding, not necessarily about how we bring a product to market, but really understanding what the external value of that product may be to the lifestyle elements of the individual consumers. So whether or not, for example, their visit to Australia in terms of conspicuous consumption space, whether or not it actually brings brag value or status to our visitors. There's also issues about technology and the role that technology can play over time, and also a shift from yield to, or volume to yield, and consequently activity to productivity. These are changes in thinking that have to underpin the sort of research we do if, as academics, we want to be of value to the industry.
I think also in the context of that we often talk about yin-yang and the Tao, and I think Westerners actually laugh and think it might be some sort of philosophical underpinning that might be quite remote. It's actually not quite remote. It's actually very, very deep in the Chinese psyche. And just as Byron's pointing out there, things like relationships and transaction, they work both together. So, it's not either or, it's both and we need to understand that. So that's why it's often complex, but you can break through those barriers if you understand the philosophy behind it.